welcome in. It's great to see you. I think I've said hi to most everybody, but hi again.
Actually, I think you just hit me.
Well, that works too. So, 1 Kings chapter 7 is where we are. Please open your Bible there if you don't mind to do that. 1 Kings, the 7th chapter. We're a little light tonight, aren't we? Hopefully we have more filing in before too long. We probably will. So, for those of you who have built a house, I know we've had some discussions on this. For those of you who have built a house, and I've just watched others do it and said, no, that's good enough. I don't need to do that. I've seen you do it. But for those who have it, when you're given an itinerary of, hey, this is how things are going to go by Bob the Builder in the beginning, and you're told it's going to be about this time that we're finished and you get to move in, how do things typically go according to that plan, that timeline? You know, okay, see, I don't have the experience, so I appreciate an expert sharing that with us. Thank you, Emily. That's what I've always heard, what I've always seen. Things are behind schedule.
Kind of like buying a house and thinking you're going to move in it the next day.
You know, that's not funny, Paul, so. But I can only imagine, yeah, it works just like that, right? So yeah, it seems like it takes a little longer, you know, and sometimes the months turn into years. And well, let's start reading in chapter 7 of 1 Kings and in the first verse. I say start reading. Actually, this one is our memory verse, and you're welcome. A little bit of a gift here, somewhat shorter than what we've been having, some other ones. So who would like to say 1 Kings 7 in the first verse? Okay, go ahead.
Solomon was building his house for 13 years and he finished it.
Whew! How long did it take you to build your house? For those who have 6 months. Now that's expedited. That is very nice right there. How would you like to be in Solomon's shoes? So Solomon's been involved in this building project, and he's been constructing a house, right? We know by now the first house that he constructs, and we've somewhat concluded that. We're going to get some more details of that in chapter 7 from what we read in the 6th chapter. But he's constructed the house of the Lord. How long did it take him to build that house? 7 years. And then we're told at the end of the chapter, that's rounded off in the Bible, right? We're told it's 7 years and 6 months, but typically we read it as 7 years, right? So now he builds his house whenever he's done, but he gives attention and priority to the house of God first. And so he constructs this beautiful, ornate worship facility in part. Actually, the temple proper is not for worship as much as it is for priests and the business that they're going to do in there, but the people will worship outside in the outer court. But yeah, now he's going to be working on his house, and he does that, and it takes him 13 years to finish that. Okay, so there are a couple of different ways that you can look on this. If you're considering in 1 Kings 7:1 that it takes him 13 years and he works on the house of God 7 years, you might see it as, well, he gives twice the attention to his own house than he does the house of God. Is that proper? Is that the way things ought to operate? So why do you think it might be that it takes him about double the time to build his own house compared to the house of God, Roy?
Probably used a lot more forced labor on the.
There you go. I think that makes a lot of sense. So let's go back, not too much and for too long. But let's go back into chapter 5. 1 Kings chapter 5. And as was pointed out, you might recall there are a whole lot of people that are working on God's house. Now, we might not have the exact numbers for Solomon's house and how many are working, but I'm going to say it's probably less than what we had here. So 1 Kings 5, in verses 13 through 16, King Solomon drafted forced labor out of all Israel, and the draft numbered 30,000 men. He sent them to Lebanon, 10,000 a month in shifts. They would be a month in Lebanon, 2 months at home. Adoniram was in charge of the draft. Solomon also had 70,000 burden bearers and 80,000 stone cutters in the hill country, besides Solomon's 3,300 chief officers who were over the work, who had charge of the people who carried on the work. So, yeah, there's a lot of people that are helping for the construction of the temple, and that could be an explanation as to why it would go so much more quickly than what the building of Solomon's own house. Okay, anything else that we can consider? We're going to find the size of Solomon's house and everything that surrounds the temple proper. It's much larger than what the other one was. Really, the Old Testament temple is not very big. We give a lot of attention to it. It costs a lot of money to build it. But look in chapter 6 of 1 Kings. Chapter 6, just a reminder in the second verse, the house that King Solomon built for the Lord was 60 cubits long. How many feet long? Went through these calculations, so it's just one and a half times, right? Okay, so 90 feet long, 20 cubits wide. Okay, 30 in width. And then 30 cubits, careful, 30, not the same answer, 30 cubits high, 45. All right, we got some sharp mathers, just like before. Very good. So it's 90 feet by 30 feet, and then the height of it's 40. I mean, that's really not that big. So it makes sense that it wouldn't have taken as long to construct it. One other thing that we can consider, Solomon has a little help in preparatory work in building the temple. Why is that? Who has helped him, even though he's not around anymore when construction begins? Daddy has helped him. Yeah, and he helps in gathering all of these supplies. But even Solomon himself spent some time involved in this business. Also in chapter 5, this time verses 17 and 18. At the king's command, they quarried out great costly stones in order to lay the foundation of the house with dressed stones. So Solomon's builders and Hiram's builders and the men of Gebal did the cutting and prepared the timber and the stone to build the house. Now, if you look at the end of chapter 6, verses 37 and 38, in the 4th year, the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid in the month of Ziv. And in the 11th year, so 7 total years, in the month of Bul, which is the 8th month, the house was finished in all its parts, and according to all its specifications, he was 7 years, and a little more technically 7.5 years in the construction, the building of it. But exactly, you're right. And for those who didn't hear, it was built like a prefabricated house, Roy's saying, would be today. That's basically what it is. So that time period of 7.5 years doesn't begin until the foundation, the stones are actually laid. Well, the time's already spent in quarrying them out, and that would have taken a long time to deal with that. So a lot of preparatory work, and I would say for those reasons, it takes a lot longer to build Solomon's own house and really the surrounding temple complex than it does just the temple proper. All right, so that's verse 1, our memory work. Solomon took 13 years to build his own house, so he finished all his house. A lot of stuff to cover tonight, so let's get to it. Verse 2, he also built the mysterious house of the forest of Lebanon. Its length was 100 cubits. So how long? I see he's calculating. Look at her, yeah. 150? Yeah, I think you said good. So 150 feet long, already longer. Its width, 50 cubits, 75 feet. And its height, 30 cubits. Okay, that sounds similar, doesn't it? 45, but already we have more of a scope and size. With 4 rows of cedar pillars. And so you have these pillars that are in line with each other, and then cedar beams on or that rest atop of the pillars. In size, the house of the forest of Lebanon, 150 feet by 75 feet by 45 feet. Verse 3, and it was paneled with cedar above the beams, so this is going to serve as something over the top, and that were on 45 pillars. This would have been beautiful to behold. 45 pillars, 15 to a row. What I would like to do, I know it's not necessarily just a great close-up, but we have several things that we're discussing. If this is helpful at all, this is a diagram of what it is at which we're going to be looking. Here in a little bit, we'll discuss the house of Pharaoh's daughter. I mentioned the courtyard, okay, and that's where the worshipers would actually gather. Of course, not being priests, nobody has the right to enter into the temple proper. But then you have the temple and, of course, Mount Moriah in Jerusalem. And then we're going to be talking about the porch, 2 different porches, the porch of pillars, the porch of the throne. And now we're discussing right now, you see in the left kind of center portion of the screen, by the way, nice to have our screens back, isn't it? Thank you. Thank you, Marty. And all involved. The house of the forest of Lebanon. And so you can see these pillars and how resting will take place and then building on top of those. So it was paneled, the house of Lebanon, with cedar above the beams that were on 45 pillars. Beautiful. 15 to a row. There were windows with beveled frames in 3 rows, and window was opposite window in those 3 tiers. And all the doorways and doorposts had rectangular frames, and window was opposite window in 3 tiers. I think the real significance here is probably the purpose for which these various facilities are going to serve. And so the house of the forest of Lebanon. Turn to 1 Kings chapter 10, obviously keeping your spot in the text of chapter 7. But 1 Kings 10, and we're going to look at 2 different spots that will give us, I think, a further indication as far as its usage goes. 1 Kings 10:17, a little bit down the line. It's mentioned, and he, Solomon, made 300 shields of beaten gold, 3 minas of gold went into each shield, and the king put them in the house of the forest of Lebanon. So he's made 300 shields, and they're going to be stored in that place. So what's it sound like the house of the forest of Lebanon is being used for? An armory. Yeah, this is part of this, of course, would be defense, and I think we're going to find also weaponry of Israel. And so it's being used as an armory, it appears, of sorts. Now turn to Isaiah chapter 22, where we're given a little more indication as far as its potential purposes. Isaiah 22 and the 8th verse. It's mentioned, he has taken away the covering of Judah, like it's protection of sorts. In that day, he says, you look to the weapons of the house of the forest. Okay, so a couple of concepts here. One that we've already established. Not only is there defense found here, but there are also weapons that can be used for war. And it's mentioning the covering or the protection of Judah. Some believe that this could perhaps also be the residence of the royal bodyguard. You know, the men of men, the toughest, the choice warriors, where they stay. And so Israel, in times of trouble, looking there for help could be because that's where a lot of defense is found. And so that could make some sense. And it's mentioned about the gold that's used and form these. Some also believe it could have been used partially as a treasury for the country as well. So that's the house of the forest of Lebanon. We can look around in Scripture and get a little bit of an indication as to its usages. Now let's discuss in verse 6. He also made the hall of pillars. All right, or the porch of pillars. So the hall of pillars, its length was 50 cubits, so a measurement of what? 75 feet. Its width is 30 cubits. We've encountered this number a few times. It's going to be 45, so 45 feet wide. And in front of them was a portico, or a porch, with pillars, and a canopy was in front of them. And what's going on right here, as you can tell from our diagram, that this hall of pillars is going to connect the hall, or the house of the forest, with a place that's called the house of judgment. The house of judgment. We're not quite there yet in verse 7. It's mentioned by James Smith in his commentary that litigants probably waited here in this spot until they were called upon to present their case before the king, as he's involved with the judging of his people. So that's the hall of pillars. Okay, so let's move on into verse 7. Then he made a hall for the throne. That's the hall of judgment, where he might judge. So obvious purpose there. And it was paneled with cedar from the floor all the way up to the ceiling. And in addition to that, the house where he had dwelt had another court inside the hall of like workmanship. Solomon also made a house like this hall for Pharaoh's daughter, whom he had taken as wife. Huh. Well, that's kind of strange. He's going to have a place where he hangs out and lives, and then Pharaoh's daughter builds a house for her. Let's not forget the relationship involved. That's his wife. I don't know if that makes for happy wife, happy life, where she gets to just live away from her husband. Maybe so. But that's kind of strange, though, isn't it? Why does she have her own house? Why is she just living right there? Maybe. Okay, maybe. Maybe, hey, listen, like you but don't love you, this is strictly business? All right. Yeah, and that could be too, Paul, what do you think?
I was thinking maybe he tolerated things from her.
So Paul's saying maybe it's something involved with idolatry. Maybe she's still connected to her former gods of Egypt. Paul, I hate to play Monday morning quarterback, but we're living after the game. The big game's been played on Sunday, right? So we get to look back and say, no, this is what you should have done, dummy. And that's easy to do. Now, as we look backward, we know what happens afterward in Solomon's life and the connection involving the foreign wives. And so I think there's probably a good chance to that. She may very well still be holding on to her religion. And turn back to Deuteronomy chapter 7. You might recall as the Israelites, we're going back about 500 years here. By the way, as we're turning to Deuteronomy 7, for those who are interested in following chronology, we are just about exactly at 950 BC, okay, where we are in 1 Kings 7, 950 BC. So we're rewinding to about 1450 BC, which is 500 years prior to this. And in the second giving of the law, the Israelites, of course, going in before long to take the land. Verse 1 of Deuteronomy 7, when the Lord your God brings you into the land that you're entering, take possession of it. He's going to clear away many nations from before you and names the 7 peoples that are more numerous and mightier than yourselves. When he gives them over to you, you must defeat them thoroughly, ... Verse 3, he has this rule, you shall not intermarry with them, giving your daughters to their sons or taking their sons, their daughters for your sons. For they, here's the issue, would turn away your sons from following me to serve other gods, and God's going to be so angry with you, essentially what he says when that occurs. Verse 6, for you are a people holy to the Lord your God. You're set apart. You are separate from them. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for his treasured possession out of, away from all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. And I realize in these 7 nationalities, the Egyptians aren't found here. They weren't the dwellers in the land of Canaan. However, there's a reasoning that's laid forth, and that is you can't join yourself to pagan peoples in marriage and expect everything is going to go great with you and your marriage and with your kids and with your grandkids. And no, I'm telling you this for your own good. Okay, is there that specific prohibition with the Egyptians? No, we don't find that in the Old Testament. But they also have pagan gods, as the Israelites very well know from their history. And he says, be careful for this reason. Would the principle not also be applicable with the Egyptians? Be separate from them. Okay, so now turn to 2 Chronicles chapter 8 before we go back to our main passage. And if you're wondering, this is the parallel. You might want to put a mark here if you're able to. We'll flip a few other times to this area here in 2 Chronicles 8. 2 Chronicles 8 and the 11th verse. Solomon brought Pharaoh's daughter up from the city of David to the house that he had built for her, for he said, my wife shall not live in the house of David, king of Israel, for the places to which the ark of the Lord has come are holy. Ouch. I wouldn't write this poem if I were him and give it to her on Valentine's Day. I don't think she's going to appreciate it. But, I mean, he's just making a statement of fact here that we have to have a separate place for her to be because he insinuates she is unholy. And, Paul, I do believe that gives credence to the idea. I don't know that she is a proselyte here to Judaism. I think she probably retains her own background, and especially probably also with her God. So, going back to our passage of 1 Kings 7, the 8th verse, it's significant to us now, recollecting all of this, because he feels a spiritual necessity, and I think for good reason, to build her own separate house where she can live, even though she's his wife. Verse 9, all of these were of costly stones in this construction. They were trimmed with saws. They were cut to size, inside, out, from the foundation to the eaves, and also on the outside to the great court. The foundation was of costly stones. We're talking large stones, the writer says. Some 10 cubits and some 8 cubits. Okay, so let's think about this. And we're not given anything other than one measurement. I'm going to say probably, and because these are stones that construction is going to be on, these are probably cubes, would be my guess, would make a lot of sense. So we have 8 cubits. What kind of size there in L, W, and H? That's big. That is large, 12. Okay, and what about the other, the 10? That's 50. We're talking stones as much as 15 feet long, 15 feet wide, perhaps also, we're not given, but maybe even 15 feet high, but in the very least, the length and the width is probably going to be similar, if not exact, to one another. It's a marvel to me, the construction of this. Absolutely fascinating. I mentioned just like the pyramids of Egypt and all this stuff that people of old times built. So at our house, from some landscaping that we've done, I didn't go out and measure these, but I'm going to say we have some rocks that we bought at a really good price from a local guy. Consider that. We're in the Ozarks, and I'm buying rocks from people, right? But we have rocks, and I would say they're probably about 4 feet by maybe about, 3 or so. So about 4 by 3. And it's interesting because you look at those rocks, and when the guy he brought in a skid steer, big old strong guy. He's actually a vet, military vet, that is. And big old strong guy, he doesn't mess with that with hands. Nobody does. He brings it in, he brings a skid steer off his trailer and picks those up and positions them. And he's like, okay, now how do you want them facing? And I'm thinking, well, we'll just get them pretty close. And I mentioned to him, if I ever need to, we can get quite a few guys and we can move those around. And he's like, you're not going to be moving that. Really? And so I get over there and, and that's only probably a 4 by 3. I mean, you can't budge those things. You're talking 15 by 15 and probably much thicker than what my rocks are. Isn't that incredible in times where there were no skid steers and trailers like we have them anyway? Just amazing. These things were cut to perfection, first of all, and secondly, just the movement of those and giving them position just right. Amazing. So all of these stones, costly stones, were cut to the perfect side, trimmed exactly as they should be, inside, outside, everything's perfect. And remember when we were reading earlier about the temple, even the stones that would not be seen, he made sure were flawless in every way. I think there's a New Testament connection there, as we discussed earlier. So we go down to verse 11, and above were costly stones. So you're not just talking about foundation, but as you build up also, remember what Jesus says later about, of course, it's the third temple by that point that's been constructed, and the disciples, they're kind of like I am, but man, they get the blessing of in person, saying, wow, look at these buildings. Are these not amazing, Jesus? And he says, yeah, they're pretty impressive, but I have news to report to you. Not one stone that you see will be left stacked on another. I can't hardly fathom tearing the things down, much less lifting them up and getting them where they need to be. But there are all these stones, not just in the foundation, but as well built up higher, hewn to size. And also, of course, there's just cedar wood everywhere, cedars of Lebanon. The great court was enclosed with 3 rows of hewn stones and a row of cedar beams. So were the inner court of the house of the Lord and the vestibule or the portico. You might have the porch also of the temple. Any ideas as we're discussing here the hall of judgment where the king's going to issue his verdicts? Any ideas why there might be 3 rows of the stones that are to be found? Bible numbers. What's 3? If he's going to be a great king and successful, stones are heavy, they're solid, they're strong. He's going to have the strength, 3 rows of divine judgment behind him. I don't know that for sure, but you see some numbers popping out here, and that could make some sense. So in verse 13, we're introduced to a very significant figure in this construction process who is an outsider / insider. He's both. Now, King Solomon sent and brought, I have in my translation, Huram. What do you have there? If it's different. That's New King James. Hiram. Okay. We have to be careful not to get confused here. We've been introduced to Hiram, but this isn't the same one. There's a Hiram, and who's he? Hint, hint, he's Hiram up. Okay, now that's the king of Tyre. And we're not talking about this guy. If it is, now we don't know the vowels from Hebrew, so maybe it's the same name, Hiram, maybe the translators are like, let's just call him something else so we don't get him confused. We don't know for sure what their spellings are or the way it be pronounced. But so it's either Huram or Hiram, and this is not the king of Tyre. This is somebody else, but with the same name, probably common in that place. So King Solomon sent and he brought, excuse me, Huram or Hiram from Tyre. So same location though, but this guy was the son of a widow from the tribe of Naphtali. So what's his background, ethnically speaking? He's a Jew. Well, hold on, kind of. And his father was a man of Tyre. He's a Gentile, kind of. And so, yeah, he has his background in Tyre, which is really important because we've encountered the know-how, the expertise in construction and all these different things. So he's been trained, obviously, in all of the building techniques up north that the Israelites are really needing, but I think it's probably kind of nice because he has some Jewish persuasion to him also. And maybe they feel like they can trust him more for that reason. And it may just be for his sheer skill, as we're going to find.
Chronicles, he's described as a massive craftsman.
Very good, and that's where I'm going, so appreciate that. No, that's excellent, Roy. He's a bronze worker. He was filled with wisdom, understanding, skill, and working with all kinds of bronze work. So he came to King Solomon and did all his work. I appreciate you bringing that up. So let's go to 2 Chronicles 2. If you've kept your mark, it's not chapter 8 where we were, but it's pretty close. 2 Chronicles chapter 2, and we're given more information about this guy as Chronicles tends to do, a little more detail. In verses 13 and 14, we read, and actually if you go up, you find in verse 11, then Hiram the king of Tyre answered in this letter that he sends to Solomon, notice verse 13, now I have sent a skilled man who has understanding. Here it's Huram Abai. Do you have something else right there? This is ESV this time. Huram Abai or Abi perhaps? It appears it's just another name for the guy, same guy that we're discussing over here. He's the son of a woman of the daughters of Dan, and his father was a man of Tyre. He is trained to work in. He's not just really good with bronze. He is trained to work in gold, silver, bronze, iron, stone, wood, and in purple, blue, and crimson fabrics, and fine linen. What are his limitations? None. And to do all sorts of engraving and execute any design that may be assigned him with your craftsmen, the craftsmen of my Lord, David your father. So if that helps, you have one Hiram talking about another Hiram. It may be the exact same name. So two different guys, but as Roy pointed out, he's not just good with bronze. He's good with every metal. He's good with stone. He's phenomenal with wood, with fabric. He can do anything that you want him to do. And of course, he says, you have all these talented guys anyway, but let this guy come in and head up the operation. He's going to help you out immensely. Verse 15 of our passage back in 1 Kings 7. And he cast 2 pillars. These are really cool. 2 pillars of bronze, each one. And by the way, you might have in your heading here, we're crossing over a little more temple side of things again. More details of that. He cast 2 pillars of bronze, each one 18 cubits high, and a line of 12 cubits measured the circumference of each. So let's start with circumference. Of course, that's distance around. And at what are we looking there? 18, no, I'm sorry, excuse me. No, I had 12, right? Sorry, my bad on that. So 12 cubits. So when we translate that, that's where my 18's coming in. 18 feet around. These things are massive pillars. And then you have, what do we have? 18, right? That's where I was confusing. The 18 tall, those are cubits, so how high? 27 feet high. 18 feet around. These things have been massive. Beautiful too, I'm sure. 16. Then he made 2 capitals. If you're wondering what this is, it'll become a little clearer in a moment, but that's just toppings. That's the angel on top of the Christmas tree. All right. So they're the toppings are the capitals of cast bronze that are going to be set on. Here we find the tops of the pillars. The height of one capital was 5 cubits, and the height of the other capital was 5 cubits. So how many feet are we adding to the top? This is a big angel. Not an actual angel. Huh? 7.5. Okay, so we have 27 feet and 7.5. How high are we getting now? There we go, 34.5 feet. We're getting pretty tall. He made a lattice network with wreaths of chain work for the capitals which are on top of the pillars, 7 chains for one capital, and seven for the other capital. We know the importance of 7. That makes sense. By the way, the two pillars, power, 7, perfection, 3, divinity, the stones, solidity, strength. Verse 18, so he made the pillars in 2 rows of pomegranates above the network all around to cover the capitals that were on top, and thus he did for the other capital. I hate this word. Are you that way too? It just does not register with me. The toppings, okay, the tops, which are on the top of the pillars in the hall, were in the shape of lilies. So it's not angels that are up there, but it's like flowers up there. 4 cubits, so in feet, 6 feet. That's of size, like the size of a grown man in height. The capitals on the 2 pillars also had pomegranates above, and so this is to make it look more elaborate, beautiful, by the convex surface which was next to the network, and there were 200 such pomegranates in rows on each of the capitals all around. Then he set up the pillars by the vestibule or the porch of the temple. He set up the pillar on the right and called its name Jachin, and he set up the pillar on the left and called its name Boaz. There's a suggestion that these might represent the power and the eternality of God, and it could be. But these names, let's talk about those. Jachin means he shall establish. And then Boaz, like the character, of course, later in Scripture, Boaz means in him is strength. And so I think you have 2 ideas represented here for God, that God is strong, and the other idea that God can use that strength to and for his people to build them up, to be their support. The tops of the pillars were in the shape of lilies, so the work of the pillars was finished. Now this one, I keep saying this is neat. I feel like this is really cool too. The sea and the oxen. Okay, verse 23. And he made the sea of cast bronze. Whoa. What's the sea? So it's like the Sea of Galilee, the Mediterranean Sea, the Dead Sea. What sea is he creating? I thought only God makes seas. It's not a geographical body of water. What this is actually going to be is a very large basin of water. And here you see a diagram, a drawing of that. A very large basin of water, not the lowers that you see around, but the upper one we'll talk about on what it rests, the images that are found there. Any ideas as to why this might be called a sea? What comes to mind when you say sea or hear sea? S-E-A. Water, good. What else? Large. I think that's probably good enough right there. Large water. This is a large body of water as far as man-made type stuff, especially for that time. He made the sea, or this large basin, container of water. He cast it bronze 10 cubits from one brim to the other. And what is meant by that is one side to the other. So in a circle, if you have from one side to the other side directly, what do we call that in math? The diameter. And the diameter is 10 cubits, which is how many feet? 15 feet in diameter. It was completely round, so we have the right shape to be figuring that. It's a circle. Its height was 5 cubits. How tall? 7.5 feet. And a line of 30 cubits measured its circumference. Again, that's the distance around. And that number is 30 cubits. So what's the circumference? 45 feet. 15 feet in diameter, 7.5 feet tall, 45 feet in circumference. This is a big old-fashioned swimming pool, is what this is. Below its brim were ornamental buds encircling it all around, 10 to a cubit, of course being about 18 inches, so you'd find about 10 of those in an 18-inch span, all the way around the sea, quote unquote. The ornamental buds were cast in 2 rows. When it was cast, it stood on as you can see in the diagram, 12 oxen. 12 is what number in the Bible? I'm sorry? Okay, very good. Number of the tribes of Israel, the sons of Israel, the apostles, the judges of Israel, all kinds of stuff. Also, so happens to be the books of history. But it's the religious number, okay? So you have 2 rows, power, 12 oxen, religious number, 3 looking toward the north, 3 looking toward the west, 3 looking toward the south, 3 looking toward the east. 3, 3, 3, the divine number. And so you piece it all together and you have these concepts. The power of divine strength rests upon religion. Rests upon religion and those who are religious or those who have trust in God. The sea was set upon them, was placed upon religion, built upon it. And all their back parts pointed inward. So as you can tell, their heads and their horns are facing outward. Verse 26, it was a handbreadth thick. And so about the width of an average man's hand, that's the thickness of that brim, pretty thick. And its brim was shaped like the brim of a cup, like a lily blossom. It contained 2,000 baths. Okay, I've never measured the bath water for my kids. Maybe a little different there. So translating that for our purposes, that's 11,500 gallons. I told you, this is an old-fashioned swimming pool, 11,500 gallons. Whenever it's filled up, the estimates are it'd be about 30 tons in total weight. There's a rabbinic tradition that indicates that sea was provided, as suggested in the image here, with taps or faucets, and it may have been very well out of the oxen's mouths, and so water could be extracted from it and used for various purposes that we're going to find. Verse 27, he also made 10 carts of bronze. So what you see below in a smaller form, but it's kind of like, not exactly what you see above. There were 10 of those that were constructed, and there are various representations. I wouldn't take these in exactness to heart, okay? You'll find some small distinguishing factors in different ones that you see, but it gives an idea anyway. So there are 10 carts of bronze. 4 cubits was the length of each cart. 4 cubits is its width. So I think it's pretty well represented that we have the geometric shape of a square right here. And then it's 3 cubits in its height. So we're not looking at a perfect cube, and it's also going to have wheels on which it resides. And this was the design of the cart. They had panels, and the panels were between frames. On the panels, hey, is this, what time you got? Oh, good. Okay. I was hoping that was, yeah, I'm happy. Okay, thanks. And on the panels that were between the frames were lions and oxen and cherubim. And by the way, so we know what lions and oxen are. Cherubim, of course, obviously, some sort of heavenly, most believe angelic type of creature, maybe even a ranking of angels. But they're often found in what kind of presence? Yeah, they're typically depicted in Scripture, the presence of God. Okay. The frames were on a pedestal, or on the frames, excuse me, was a pedestal on top. Below the lions and oxen were wreaths of plated work. Every cart had 4 bronze wheels and axles of bronze, and its 4 feet had supports. Under the laver were supports of cast bronze beside each wreath. Its opening inside the top of inside the crown at the top was 1 cubit in diameter, and so we're looking at 1.5, right? 1.5 feet. And the opening was round, shaped like a pedestal, 1.5 cubits in outside diameter. That's going to be, if I remember correctly, 2 1/4. I think is correct. So 2 1/4 feet there. Outside diameter. And also on the opening were engravings, but the panels were square, not round. Under the panels were the 4 wheels, and the axles of the wheels were joined to the cart. The height of a wheel was 1.5 cubits, so that's 2 1/4 feet tall. The workmanship of the wheels was like the workmanship of a chariot wheel, as you might be able to see. Their axle pins, their rims, spokes, and hubs were all cast bronze, and there were 4 supports at the 4 corners. Its supports were part of the cart itself. On the top of the cart, at the height of 1/2 cubit, it was perfectly round. On the top of the cart, its flanges and its panels were of the same casting. On the plates of its flanges and on its panels, he engraved cherubim, lions, and palm trees, so that it looked really nice, decorative. Wherever there was a clear space on each, with wreaths all around. Thus he made the 10 carts. 10, the number of completeness in Scripture. All of them were of the same mold, one measure, and one shape. Then he made 10 lavers, or basins, of bronze. Each laver contained 40 baths. Okay, that's 230 gallons for those keeping track. Each one would hold 230 gallons. And each laver was 4 cubits, 6 feet. On each of the 10 carts was a laver. And he put 5 carts on the right side of the house, and he also put 5 on the left side of the house. He set the sea on the right of the house toward the southeast. I know we don't have a lot of time left, but turn over to 2 Chronicles chapter 4. If you're wondering, what is going on with all this stuff, and why is it being built? We're told why it is it's going to be used, again, in a little more detailed account. 2 Chronicles 4, verse 6, he also made 10 basins in which to wash, and he set 5 on the south side, 5 on the north side, and these they were to rinse off what was used for the burnt offering. So this would be used to clean up the mess from all the sacrifice. You're going to need some water to clean that up. And we're told here, the sea, the big one, big swimming pool, it was for the priests to wash in. Okay, so that's the difference between the two and the purposes for which they were being used. Verse 40 of our main text. Huram, probably better Hiram, made the lavers and the shovels and the bowls. So he finished all the work that he was to do for King Solomon for the house of the Lord. And then he goes through and names all these things. In verse 45, all these articles which Hiram made for King Solomon for the house of the Lord were of burnished bronze. In the plain of the Jordan, the king had them cast in clay molds between Succoth and Zeraton. I want to look at that as we wind things up here. Those are 2 places not very far from each other. You can tell by your legend that's about 10 miles. Zerathon is away from Succoth. And if you split the difference roughly, what's in the middle of those? The Jordan River. They need clay to have clay and to make clay, to mold clay. You also need water, right, for these sizable molds that are going to be cast. So it's the perfect spot in the Jordan River Valley to be able to do this. And here's blowing it out a little bit more. That's in an area about the bottom 1/3 of the Jordan River Valley. And Solomon did not weigh all the articles, didn't bother, because there were so many. The weight of the bronze was not determined. Thus Solomon had all the furnishings made for the house of the Lord, the altar of gold, the table of gold on which was the showbread, the lampstands of pure gold, 5 on the right side, 5 on the left, in front of the inner sanctuary with the flowers, lamps, and the wick trimmers of gold, the basins, the trimmers, the bowls, the ladles, and the censers of pure gold, and the hinges of gold, both for the doors of the inner room, the most holy place, and for the doors of the main hall of the temple. So all the work that King Solomon had done for the house of the Lord was finished, and Solomon brought in the things which his father had dedicated. Thank you, Dad, for all the helpful preparation. Sped up the process. The silver and the gold and the furnishings, and he put them in the treasuries of the house of the Lord. So all this construction is now finished, and just like if someone's building a house for himself, herself, for a couple, for a family, whenever it's done, it's a long, tedious process. It took a lot longer than what we'd expected it to take. But when it's all said and done, comes a very glorious time. When all the construction's completed, what's left to do? Okay, well, right. But in terms of just building a house, you know about that. What happened when your house was done, the construction? There you go. And that's a very special time, okay? It's time to move into this. And that's what happens right here. All these furnishings that have been prepared, all the furniture for the, for us, it's the couches and the beds and the TVs, but for them, it's the lampstands, it's the tables, and it's all of these items are going to be brought in. They're set up, and they're all ready to go, but they're not going to go until they dedicate this special house of God. And we'll work on that next week from chapter 8. I hope we can get through all of it. I don't know if we will. We'll cover what we can. For next week, if you will, chapter 8, verse 27 would be a really good memory passage. It's a good one for us to recall. But outside of that, that's tonight's class. Any comments that you have, and the construction, the finality of it, the temple complex, including where Solomon's going to live, where his wife's going to live, and the house of, or the porch of pillars, and the hall of judgment. You good? I'm good. All right, that's what we'll do next week. Thanks.